The Roman legions were once the most disciplined and effective military force of the ancient world. They built roads, founded cities, pushed the borders of an empire that stretched across 3 continents, and maintained order wherever they marched. Yet among the countless legions recorded with careful detail, there were some that vanished in ways no one can fully explain. Their records end abruptly, archaeological traces appear only in fragments, and their names quietly drop from official lists as if they had never existed at all. What makes their story so compelling is not just the fact that they disappeared, but that each legion was born with a clear purpose. Some were created to guard the empire's northern frontier. Others were raised to drive Rome's expansion eastward. Some were formed right on the battlefield, assembled in moments of crisis to turn the tide of war. They fought in conflicts that shaped Roman history, leaving behind military achievements, architectural footprints, and even cultural influences that endured long after they were gone. And then, for reasons as varied as war, political reform, disease, or shifting power, they faded from the official narrative. Their names were removed, their banners were retired, their last campaigns were left unrecorded. Only when archaeologists uncover stamped bricks, fragments of armor, coins, or buried encampments do we catch glimpses of their final journey. In bedtime history, we will trace each of these forgotten legions, where they were formed, what they fought for, what they accomplished, and why, in the end, they disappeared from the written memory of Rome. Let the story unfold softly as we follow the quiet footsteps of armies that once shaped the ancient world, only to slip into silence. When we think of Roman legions, we often imagine ranks of soldiers with iron discipline, polished armor, and campaigns that reshaped the map of the ancient world. But before we talk about the lost legions, the first thing we need to understand is not how they disappeared, but why they existed. A Roman legion never came into being by accident. Each one was born from the deeper needs of the Roman state, the need to expand, to control, to deter rebellion, or to restore order in newly annexed lands. During the Republic, legions were raised only when war became unavoidable. When the campaigning season ended, those armies dissolved, leaving Rome to return to its familiar rhythm of life. But as the empire grew with each generation of conquest, a seasonal army was no longer enough to hold it together. Newly claimed territories needed constant garrisons. Unsubdued tribes needed to be reminded of Roman power. Newly opened trade routes needed protection. Slowly, the legions became a standing force, units with permanent bases, living on the frontier more often than in Rome itself, and tying their identity to the lands they guarded for generations. The names of the legions, Hispana, Augusta, Ferrata, Germanica, were never just labels assigned during recruitment. They were the crystallized story of where a legion had fought, what campaigns it endured, or which emperor had founded it. A name could be a source of pride, but it could just as easily become a burden. A victorious legion might be granted an additional title. A defeated or rebellious one might be stripped of its honors or erased completely from the records as if it had never existed. For the Roman government, forgetting a legion was sometimes simply a practical tool for establishing a new order. This system became unmistakably clear under Augustus, the architect of Rome's professional army. He maintained roughly 25 to 30 legions, though the number was never fixed. A new emperor could create additional legions in preparation for expansion, or dissolve existing ones for political, financial, or disciplinary reasons. A single decision from the imperial court could make a legion vanish from written documents, not because it had been destroyed, but because it had been reorganized, merged, or made irrelevant to the empire's new strategy. A typical Roman legion included around 5,000 heavy infantry, a unified fighting machine, yet built from countless individuals with their own homes, families, dreams, and fears. When a legion slips out of the historical record, what disappears is not just a military unit, but a community that had existed for decades, a place where sons followed fathers into service, where the camp gradually grew into a small town with roads, workshops, granaries, and hundreds of everyday stories. That is why, to understand how a legion could go missing, we must begin with its presence. A legion existed because Rome needed it, in a specific place, at a specific moment, for a specific problem. And when those needs changed, when borders contracted, emperors shifted, campaigns reoriented, or unexpected crises appeared, certain legions began to fade into the dim margins of history. Not because they were weak, not because they were small, but because they were pieces of a larger puzzle that time and politics rearranged in ways no one could fully foresee. From that foundation, the journey of the lost legions begins to take shape, not only as military mysteries, but as stories of an empire that was always changing, always expanding, and sometimes willing to forget the very armies that had served it for generations. To understand how a Roman legion could disappear, we have to return to the moment it was created, because the path toward vanishing always begins the very first time it steps into history. No legion ever existed just to fill space. Each one was formed because Rome needed to adapt to something larger, borders expanding too quickly, a sudden uprising, a new enemy rising, or an emperor shaping his authority with a force absolutely loyal to him. During the Republic, the military obligations of Roman citizens were enough to handle wars within the Italian peninsula. But once Rome crossed the seas and confronted unfamiliar landscapes, the forests of Germania, the deserts of Numidia, the plains of Armenia, the highlands of Syria, the weaknesses of seasonal armies became impossible to ignore. War was no longer about fighting and withdrawing, it became conquering and holding, building and defending, ruling and collecting tribute. That is why professional legions emerged, forces strong enough to stand where no Roman had ever lived before. But a legion did more than reflect the needs of the battlefield, it also reflected the inner workings of Roman politics. When Julius Caesar expanded his campaigns in Gaul, he created legions tied closely to his name, building the foundation of his political power when he returned to Rome. When Augustus stabilized the empire after the civil wars, he rebuilt the entire system so that every legion answered directly to the emperor, not to any ambitious general. Every new legion at that time was a political message. This is my army, not the Senate's. Some legions were created purely for administration. When a province was newly annexed, Rome needed soldiers who could suppress revolts and enforce the machinery of government. When a trade route became essential, like the line from Alexandria to Syria or the corridor across Asia Minor, a legion might be established solely to protect grain, gold, and goods flowing back to the empire's heart. These forces did not enter history through great victories, but through the quieter role of keeping Rome alive from within. Other legions were born out of fear. When Parthia rose as a rival in the east, Rome repeatedly raised new legions along the Syrian frontier. When the Germanic tribes began forming loose confederations, the empire positioned fresh legions along the Rhine and the Danube to deter conflict before it began. These units often lived in a state of half-war, a constant tension where danger was always near, even if the great battle had not yet arrived. Perhaps most striking of all, a legion could be raised not because of enemies beyond the border, but because of enemies within. During civil wars, those vying for power created legions to strengthen their claim. When a new dynasty rose, it often dissolved the legions associated with the previous one, using disbandment as a way to erase the symbols of the defeated. Roman history contains many legions that disappeared not because they lost a battle, but because they carried a name the new regime no longer wished to keep. And from here, the fate of a legion begins to unfold. A legion created to expand a frontier might be swallowed by a war far beyond its capacity. A legion raised to guard a trade route might fade once the route loses its strategic value. A legion formed for political motives might be wiped from the record when a new ruler takes the throne. When we look at how these legions came into existence, their disappearance no longer feels mysterious. It is the natural result of a system in constant motion, a world where military forces served both as instruments of war and instruments of power. And that is why, to understand how a legion vanished, we must first understand what brought it into being, whether it was need, ambition, or the quiet unease of an empire so vast that even Rome struggled to control it. Among all the Roman legions that ever disappeared, none has inspired more debate, more theories, or more fascination than Legio IX Hispana, the Ninth Legion Hispana. They were not a newly formed force, nor a faint, forgettable unit. They existed for more than a century, marching through Hispania, Gaul, Germania, and finally settling in Britannia. And from that distant corner of the empire, they vanished from every official record, as if thousands of soldiers had been erased from the memory of the very empire they served. But to understand this strange disappearance, we have to return to their origins. Legio IX was created in the final days of the Republic, or the early reign of Augustus, during the Celtiberian Wars. A long, grinding conflict fought in harsh terrain where guerrilla tactics wore Roman armies down. The Ninth was born to face those challenges directly. Strict discipline, rapid response, and the ability to fight in tight, ambush-filled landscapes. These survival skills became their defining character for generations. When the wars in Hispania ended, the Ninth was not disbanded. Instead, they were sent to Gaul and then to Germania, regions the Romans always regarded as their most fragile frontiers. They built forts, repaired roads, guarded borders, and helped stabilize the region after the disaster of the Teutoburg Forest. And from those precarious edges of the empire, they were deployed to Britannia, a mist-covered land that never fully submitted to Roman rule. There they faced the greatest crisis of their existence, the uprising led by Queen Boudicca in the years 60 to 61 in the Common Era. A portion of the Ninth marched out to confront the rebels, but was caught in a devastating ambush by the Iceni and Trinovantes. Nearly the entire detachment was wiped out, with only a few survivors retreating to Eboracum. Even so, the Ninth Legion was not destroyed at that moment. They were reinforced and continued to serve for nearly another half-century, playing a crucial role in building, defending, and maintaining order in Britannia. Stamped bricks marked Leg Nigh, and the remains of their camp in York confirm this continued presence. Then, in the early 2nd century, the name Ninth Hispana vanished from every Roman military document. No disbandment, no renaming, no restructuring, no final report, no hint of their end. Only absolute silence. This paved the way for 3 major theories. The first theory, they were destroyed in a campaign against the Picts in northern Britannia, a region of forests, bogs, and heavy mist where supplying an army was nearly impossible. A large-scale ambush may have annihilated the legion, and the imperial court may have chosen not to record it to protect Rome's reputation. The second theory, they left Britannia and were transferred to Germania Inferior. Inscriptions and tile stamps bearing Legni found in the Netherlands and Germany support the idea that they met their end along the Rhine during a campaign against Germanic tribes. This remains the strongest theory among historians. The third theory, they were not destroyed at all but simply erased administratively. In Rome, a legion tied to a previous dynasty or an embarrassing defeat could be renamed, merged, or quietly removed from the rolls, causing its historical record to stop instantly. From here, archaeology becomes the most important bridge for understanding what happened next. Finds at York illuminate the final chapter of their known presence. Bricks stamped Legni, a burned layer beneath their headquarters, fragments of warped armor, personal belongings of the soldiers. Together they reveal a legion that once stood strong, fought hard, and likely encountered an event that went unrecorded. The traces buried in the soil speak louder than any surviving text. Legio Ninth Hispana, therefore, is more than a mystery. They are proof that a legion which once marched across 3 continents and helped shape Rome's borders could still be swallowed by history, lost at just the right moment, on just the right frontier, during a crisis the empire wished to forget. They open the list of Rome's missing legions, and they remain the clearest symbol of history's unsettling silence, where the fate of thousands can vanish simply because no one chose to write it down. If the 9th Legion Hispana vanished in silence, then Legio 17 disappeared in the thunder of a disaster that shook the entire empire, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in the year 9 of the Common Era. But to understand that tragedy, we must return to the moment the legion was born, a time when Rome was expanding rapidly and needed new forces to control the harsh, unpredictable lands of Germania. Legio 17th was formed under Augustus, who had just reorganized the entire military after years of civil war. Rome believed it could extend its frontier all the way to the river Elbe, turning Germania into a formal province. The soldiers of the 17th were recruited from Italy and Gaul, deeply Romanized regions, creating a young, disciplined legion trained specifically to fight in forests where skilled Germanic warriors lived. Their first mission was to stabilize the Rhine frontier and open the way for deeper campaigns into Germania. There were no paved roads, the maps were nearly blank, the climate was cold and damp, and the muddy terrain slowed every march. Even so, Legio 17 proved itself in the early operations, especially in building forts and establishing supply lines, the lifelines of any Roman advance into dense, mountainous woodlands. When Publius Quinctilius Varus was appointed governor of Germania, he brought with him 3 main legions, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th. Varus was tasked with completing the Romanization of the region, establishing courts, collecting taxes, enforcing Roman law. But this sparked deep resentment among the Germanic tribes, who had never accepted Roman rule. Among their leaders was someone who understood Rome better than any other, Arminius of the Cherusci, who had lived in Rome, earned the rank of equestrian, and been trained in Roman military doctrine. Arminius deceived Varus into believing that a small rebellion needed immediate suppression. Trusting him, Varus marched all 3 legions, along with baggage trains, civilians, camp followers, livestock, and supplies, into the Teutoburg forest, where the narrow, muddy, sloping terrain made it impossible to maintain standard Roman formations. There, Legio XVII, alongside the 18th and 19th, fell into an ambush that lasted for days. Torrential rain made shields and armor slippery. The cramped paths prevented them from deploying into proper battle lines. The Germanic warriors struck from dense thickets and vanished instantly. With no fortified camp to retreat to and no supply chain, the Roman soldiers slowly collapsed from exhaustion and chaos. The confidence of the mightiest empire of its age crumbled as they faced an enemy who knew every ridge, every stream, every hidden path. Legio XVII was annihilated. No unit survived in a form strong enough to preserve the legion's structure. Their eagle, the Aquila, the sacred soul of the legion, was captured. For Rome, losing an eagle was not simply a defeat, it was an unforgivable humiliation. When the news reached Rome, Augustus is said to have cried out in anguish, "Varus, give me back my legions!" After the disaster, Rome erased the name of Legio XVII from every record, a punishment of memory and an admission of total defeat. The legion was never reformed. The site of Calchries, believed to be the heart of the battlefield, has revealed overwhelming evidence of their fate. Hundreds of iron studs from Caligae sandals, broken segments of Lorica armor, coins dated to the years 7 to 9 of the Common Era, human bones bearing deep, violent trauma, horse remains and shattered weapons. Together they paint a picture of chaos where 3 legions were crushed piece by piece. Legio XVII did not disappear because of restructuring or renaming. They vanished because they were completely wiped out, buried in a cold, wet forest, under unending rain, undone by a kind of warfare they had never been trained to face. If Legio XVII was the spear point of Rome's ambition to turn Germania into a new province, then Legio XVIII was its companion, marching the same path and sharing the same fate. Their disappearance is always mentioned alongside the disaster in the Teutoburg forest, but the journey that led them there reveals something deeper, how a legion is shaped by strategy, by imperial expectation, and by the very role it was created to fulfill. Legio XVIII was established by Augustus at the same time as the 17th and 19th, a clear sign that the emperor intended to build a stable cluster of power along the northern frontier. 3 legions strong enough to attack, but also capable of sustaining long-term control over the Germanic tribes. Within that structure, the 18th served as the backbone of support, protecting supply routes, maintaining logistics, building bridges, opening roads, constructing winter camps, and ensuring that every deep expedition into Germania had a steady flow of provisions. Without logistics, there is no campaign, and that is why the 18th appears less often in battle records, yet was more essential than almost any force on the ground. But it was precisely this stabilizing role that made them vulnerable when Varus fell into Arminius's trap. As the 3 legions marched through the Teutoburg forest, Their formation was no longer a fighting formation at all. Garrison troops, engineers, support units, wagon trains, livestock, and supplies stretched into a long, disorganized line. Legio 18, accustomed to guarding the rear and protecting transport, became trapped in a position where no Roman tactic could function. No testudo formation, no heavy infantry lines, no space to maneuver. The forest gave them no chance to survive. Narrow paths, slippery slopes after the rain, and thick vegetation reduced their visibility to only a few steps. The Germanic warriors struck again and again, disappearing into the woods before the Romans could regroup. Legio 18th was quickly split apart, fragmented into isolated clusters, each one surrounded and cut down in desperation. The young soldiers, disciplined and well-trained, could not overcome terrain that erased every advantage they possessed from the first moment of the attack. Archaeology at Calcres reveals a vivid picture of what they faced. Helmets bent and crushed by direct blows, chest straps slashed apart, Germanic spearheads driven deep into Roman armor, clusters of caligae studs lying close together, showing they were cornered in narrow pockets before being killed. The Aquila of Legio 18th has never been found, but researchers believe it was taken along with the eagles of the 17th and 19th, becoming a shared trophy that united the tribes and symbolized the absolute victory of the Germanic alliance. When Teutoburg ended, the fate of the 18th closed exactly like the two legions beside it. Erased from the roll of legions, never reformed, never renamed, never merged into another force. Rome wanted no trace that might recall the catastrophe. Though other destroyed legions throughout history were eventually rebuilt, the 17th, 18th, and 19th remain the only ones permanently removed, a punishment aimed at memory itself, buried intentionally by the empire. Ironically, Legio 18th did not disappear because it was weak. It disappeared because it entered the wrong terrain at the wrong moment under the wrong command. They did not fall from lack of skill, but because the entire Roman system, its formations, its equipment, its doctrines, became useless in a world where the Germanic tribes understood every tree, every slope, every opening between the branches. And in the silence of Teutoburg, Legio 18th became proof that sometimes a single mistake from a commander is enough to erase an entire legion, and erase their name forever from the history of Rome. Among the 3 legions wiped out in the Teutoburg forest, Legio 19th has always carried the deepest sense of tragedy. Not only because they were the youngest of the 3, but also because of the story tied to their Aquila, the sacred eagle that was stolen, becoming a haunting symbol that shadowed Roman history for decades. If the 17th and 18th represented generations of hardened Roman strength, then the 19th embodied the image of a young legion carrying the full weight of imperial honor on its shoulders. Legio 19th was formed toward the end of Augustus's reign, when Rome was pouring its energy into turning Germania into an official province. Unlike older legions with long-standing traditions, the 19th was largely composed of young recruits drawn quickly to reinforce Rome's northern strategy. They had less experience than their counterparts in the other 2 legions, but they were still trained in full Roman standards, strict discipline, tight formations, and decisive combat style. Their initial mission was to support the 17th and 18th in subduing Germanic tribes, protecting trade routes, and strengthening Roman influence in these unfamiliar lands. They were the strong reserve force ready to be thrown into any major campaign, and because of that role, they found themselves among the troops led by Publius Quinctilius Varus, when he decided to march deep into Cherusci territory in the year 9 of the Common Era, convinced he was merely quelling a minor rebellion. But in Teutoburg, that confidence collapsed within days. When the ambush began, Legio XIX quickly became one of the hardest-hit units. Their position in the long marching column left them vulnerable to being separated from the main force. Fallen trees, thick mud, narrow paths, and relentless guerrilla attacks from every direction made it impossible for them to form any defensive line. The Germanic fighters knew the terrain intimately, striking and vanishing, while the Romans had no space to counterattack. What makes the tragedy of Legio XIX stand out most is the loss of their Aquila. For a Roman legion, losing the eagle was worse than defeat. The Aquila was the soul of the legion, the symbol of Rome, and the pride of every soldier. Romans were taught to defend their eagle with their lives, for losing it meant losing the honor of the entire legion. But at Teutoburg, nothing sacred could be protected when terrain, weather, and tactics all turned against them. The Germanic warriors seized the Aquila of the 19th and carried it away as proof that Roman might could be shattered. After the disaster, Legio XIX was erased from the records alongside the 17th and 18th. No reformation, no renumbering, no absorption into another force. The empire wanted no name that could recall the catastrophe. In Roman history, very few legions were permanently erased, and the 19th was one of them. What is remarkable is that the search for the 19th eagle lasted for decades. Under Tiberius, and later under Germanicus, entire campaigns were launched for the sole purpose of recovering the eagles lost at Teutoburg. Some were eventually found, but the eagle of the 19th became one of the symbols Rome struggled hardest to reclaim. Excavations at Calchries, believed to be the main battlefield, have uncovered evidence directly tied to Legio XIX. Armor fragments typical of younger recruits, broken discipline collars, blades bent from violent impact, leather harness pieces marked with 19, human bones bearing signs of chaotic close combat. These remains reveal a battle where everything collapsed too quickly, and the young soldiers of the 19th fought until their final breath to protect their sacred symbol. But the death of Legio XIX was more than the end of a single legion. It marked the end of Rome's entire ambition to conquer Germania. After Teutoburg, Augustus and Tiberius withdrew their forces, abandoning the plan to turn the region into a province. The Roman frontier pulled back to the west, stabilizing along the Rhine, a border that shaped European history for centuries. Legio XIX thus became a symbol of the cost of overconfidence, and a reminder that even the greatest empire of the ancient world had limits when it stepped into a land it never fully understood. Legio VI Ferrata emerged in the final years of the Republic, when Julius Caesar needed a young, disciplined force capable of enduring the long campaigns in Gaul and the coming confrontation with Pompey. The legion's first soldiers came primarily from Italy and the Romanized regions of Gaul, forming an army known for endurance, accustomed to harsh climates, prolonged sieges, and the relentless rhythm of forced marches. Their name, Ferrata, or the Iron Ones, reflected Caesar's expectations. A legion that knew how to advance, how to stand firm, and how to survive in the hardest conditions. When Augustus restructured the military after the civil wars, the sixth Ferrata was reassigned to Syria, a region that served as Rome's gateway to confronting Parthia. It was a volatile frontier marked by religious tensions and shifting tribal alliances. Ferrata's duties were clear: defend the eastern border, maintain stability in Judea and Galilee, lands where uprisings erupted often, and ensure that the Levant remained firmly within Rome's sphere of influence. They stood at the crossroads of two ancient superpowers and were expected to keep that crossroad secure. For generations, the sixth Ferrata became one of Rome's military pillars in the east. They accompanied Marcus Antonius deep into Mesopotamia during his Parthian campaign in the year 36 before the Common Era, and although the campaign failed, it was Ferrata that held the line and allowed Antony's forces to withdraw nearly intact. Under King Herod the Great, they helped keep Judea stable, supporting order in a region filled with tension. And under Trajan, when Rome launched campaigns into Armenia and Parthia, Ferrata once again appeared as a principal force, guarding supply routes and securing the rear as the legions pushed into enemy territory. Ferrata's legacy was not only forged in battle, but also in what they built. They constructed fortified camps, military roads connecting Galilee and Syria, bridges, granaries, drainage systems, and defensive walls against guerrilla raids. Thanks to their presence, many towns in the Levant grew more stable, allowing Roman culture to spread and urban centers to rise around their encampments. Their legacy, therefore, is less about spectacular victories and more about endurance, adaptation, and a long-lasting influence that echoed across generations. The disappearance of the sixth Ferrata unfolded in a very different way. They were not erased in a single battle. Instead, they faded from history through changes that unfolded over centuries. The turning point came under Diocletian and Constantine, when the Roman military was completely reorganized. Older legions were broken into smaller units, renamed or absorbed into new formations to suit shifting strategies. At the same time, Parthia, Rome's chief rival in the east, collapsed and vanished, making Ferrata's strategic position far less critical. A powerful earthquake in the year 363 of the Common Era then destroyed their main base at Legio, near Megiddo. This event delivered the final blow to the legion's existence. After the disaster, no surviving records indicate that the sixth Ferrata continued as an independent unit, and they gradually disappeared from Roman military documents. Archaeological discoveries at Legio help piece together their story. Bricks stamped Leg Sea Fair, expansive camp foundations, forges and metal workshops, perfectly fitting the name Ferrata, along with sections of walls, storage facilities, drainage channels, and fragments of armor. All of it reveals a major military center where the legion maintained its presence for centuries. Looking back at Legio's sixth Ferrata today, we see that their disappearance did not come from a bloody catastrophe or a battle lost in the fog. They vanished because their role no longer suited the needs of a changing era, because military reforms reshaped the empire, and because natural disaster erased the last traces of the camp they once called home. And although they did not live on through triumphant fanfare, Ferrata left behind a durable legacy, a legion that endured quietly, adapted faithfully, and faded from history as naturally as the turning of a season. Legio III Augusta was one of the longest-lived legions of the Roman world, emerging in the final years of the Republic and surviving for nearly 4 centuries. An extraordinary lifespan for any military unit. They were born in an era when Rome was expanding rapidly westward and southward, determined to secure North Africa after the long and grinding Punic conflicts with Carthage. At first, the Third Augusta was stationed in Numidia, where they became the backbone of Roman authority in a harsh, distant, and difficult territory. The primary purpose behind creating the Third Augusta was to guard the empire's southern frontier. Although Carthage had been defeated, North Africa remained unstable, filled with nomadic tribes, rebellious client kings, and vast stretches of desert where uprisings could ignite easily. The legion was tasked with building defenses, controlling desert routes, and supporting the campaign against Jugurtha, one of Rome's most formidable opponents in the 2nd century before the Common Era. Through endurance and persistence, the Third Augusta helped Rome extend its influence into the farthest reaches of North Africa. For centuries afterward, the Third Augusta remained the region's stabilizing force. They suppressed Berber uprisings, protected scattered towns along the frontier, and maintained order in lands prone to sudden unrest. During the reign of Augustus and the emperors who followed, the legion both fought and built, constructing roads, fortresses, camps, and communication networks throughout the African provinces. Military roads carved across the Sahara, supply posts and frontier fortifications all bear the imprint of the Third Augusta, showing that they were not only a fighting force, but also the architects of Romanization across an entire region. Their legacy is most visible in Lambasis in modern Algeria, where they established their headquarters for many centuries. The ruins there, from walls, drill fields, and armories to civic structures, reveal the vast scale and influence of the legion. They transformed sparse, lightly inhabited lands into organized urban centers, bringing Roman administration and culture to areas once dominated by nomadic tribes. Without the Third Augusta, the Romanization of North Africa would never have reached the depth recorded in history. But no legion, however long-lived, is immune to upheaval. The disappearance of the Third Augusta began in the 3rd century of the Common Era, during a time when the empire was shaken by political crisis. In the year 238 of the Common Era, Emperor Gordian III dissolved the legion after they were accused of supporting the opposing faction in a North African civil conflict. Disbanding such an old and established legion was rare and shocking, a punishment that carried both military and symbolic weight. Although the legion was later re-established, it never regained its former standing. The sweeping reforms of Diocletian and Constantine, dividing legions, renaming units, and merging old forces into new ones, reshaped the Roman military entirely. The Third Augusta was gradually absorbed into the new system and faded from the official roles. By the 4th century of the Common Era, the name that had once dominated an entire region appeared only faintly in a few scattered references. Archaeology at Lambasis provides the key to reconstructing their story. Excavations have uncovered vast camp complexes, bathhouses, drill yards, inscribed monuments recording their achievements, and countless tiles stamped Leg 3 Aug. These artifacts confirm that they once wielded immense authority in controlling North Africa. Even though administrative documents had long fallen silent, the earth itself preserved their legacy. The disappearance of Legio III Augusta lacks the mystery of the Ninth Hispana or the violent tragedy of the Teutoburg legions. They vanished because politics swept them aside, because reforms blurred their identity, and because the empire moved into a new era. Yet the legacy they left, roads, cities, Roman culture, and a defensive network stretching across the desert, proves that even without disappearing in a dramatic battle, a legion could shape an entire region for centuries. Legio 22, Deotariana, is one of the most unusual legions in Roman history because it was not born from the empire itself, but from the army of an allied king. Its origins lead back to Deiotarus, the local ruler of Galatia in Asia Minor, renowned for his loyalty to Rome during the turbulent final years of the Republic. When Rome officially annexed Galatia, his army was not disbanded like most native forces. Instead, it was absorbed into the Roman military structure and elevated to become Legio 22. This was an extremely rare event, a regional kingdom's army transformed into a full Roman legion. The creation of the 22nd Deotariana reflects Rome's strategic needs in the east. They needed a force familiar with the terrain, accustomed to warfare in Asia Minor, and experienced in fighting Pontus and Armenia, frequent challengers of Roman authority. Thus the 22nd became a dedicated Eastern legion stationed in provinces bordering Parthia and active across Egypt, Judea, and Syria. They were a unique hybrid, local in origin, Roman in training, a blend of two military traditions that rarely intersected. For decades, Legio 22 Deotariana played a crucial role in the Eastern Mediterranean. They were present in Egypt during the unrest of Augustus's early reign and quickly became one of the key stabilizing forces in the region, the land that fed the entire empire with its grain. When Judea erupted in revolt, the 22nd supported Legio X Fretensis and other units in securing vital fortresses and transport routes. They also built roads, outposts, camps, checkpoints, and the infrastructure needed to maintain trade between Egypt, Sinai, and Judea. In many ways, they shaped the military and administrative framework of the eastern provinces during Rome's first century. Although not known for spectacular battlefield victories, the 22nd Deotariana was one of Rome's most reliable backbone forces. They guarded the trade routes along the Nile, suppressed minor uprisings, and maintained order in Alexandria, one of the empire's most critical economic centers. Their presence formed part of the skeleton of Roman Egypt, a province that must never be allowed to fall into chaos, as Roman officials often warned. And then they vanished, abruptly, quietly, and more mysteriously than most Roman legions. Records of the 22nd stop after the years 119 to 120 of the Common Era. There is no note of restructuring, no renumbering, no transfer elsewhere. They simply ceased to appear. Many scholars believe they were destroyed during the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea, 132 to 136 of the Common Era, one of the bloodiest conflicts Rome ever faced. The timing of their disappearance aligns with this war, and Rome's silence about heavy losses is entirely plausible, much like the erasure of Legio 17th, 18th, and 19th after Teutoburg. Another theory suggests that they suffered catastrophic losses in a little-recorded campaign in Egypt or Arabia, actions that did not receive detailed documentation. Because the 22nd originated from a native force rather than from direct Roman recruitment, the imperial court may have regarded them with lower priority. If they were wiped out, it is possible Rome chose silence rather than detailed acknowledgement, especially if it did not affect the empire's public image. Archaeology is the only bridge left to trace their story. Numerous bricks, inscriptions, and papyrus documents from Egypt marked Leg Faifith Diotar show their strong presence in Alexandria and the Nile Delta. At the fortress of Babylon, the old quarter of Cairo, excavations have uncovered brick stamps, armor fragments, and officer rings linked to them. Yet there is not a single artifact confirming their existence after the 2nd century of the Common Era, supporting the theory that they were destroyed or dissolved in a major unrecorded catastrophe. Today, Legio 22 Deotariana remains one of the Roman Empire's most unusual cases, a legion born from a client kingdom shaped under Roman discipline and then lost in the silence of deserts and administrative records. They did not fall like the legions at Teutoburg, nor did they slowly fade through reforms like Ferrata. They disappeared as a blank space in history, a reminder that even legions that once stood clearly in the light can be swallowed by time in a single turn of the empire's fate. Not every Roman legion that disappeared left behind a grand tragedy or a battle remembered for centuries. Some legions vanish without echoes, without final reports, without a single clear explanation in any surviving text. They appear briefly in the first centuries of the empire, leave behind a few scattered administrative lines, a handful of tile stamps, then fade away like ink, slowly washed out by time. This chapter does not focus on one legion, but on the lesser-known names whose quiet disappearances form some of the largest blind spots in Roman military history. Legio I Germanica is a prime example. Once a source of pride for Rome, tasked with controlling Germania Inferior, that restless frontier under constant pressure from Germanic tribes, their reputation steadily declined after accusations of corruption, mutiny, and failure in several Rhine campaigns. By the years 69 to 70 of the Common Era, during the Batavian Revolt, they chose the wrong side and were punished with dissolution. There is no evidence they were destroyed in battle. They were simply erased from the rolls, and the name Germanica was never used again for any Roman legion. Another case is Legio II Traiana Fortis. Although not completely vanished, their traces after the 3rd century grow increasingly faint. The reforms of Diocletian divided many legions, renamed them, or merged them into border units. Legio II Traiana likely fractured into smaller detachments scattered across Egypt and Arabia. For centuries, historians have debated whether they continued to exist as an independent legion or dissolved into the reorganized military network. Their ambiguity makes them one of Rome's half-lost legions. Legio X Fretensis, the force that helped besiege Jerusalem, is another legion rich in archaeological remains yet obscure in its ending. After crushing the Judean revolt, they continued to garrison the region and later moved into Arabia. But by the 3rd century, references to Fretensis appear less and less, and by the 4th century they vanish entirely from the record. All that remains are stamped tiles, emblems and foundations of ancient camps scattered around Jerusalem, Masada and Petra, while the legion itself dissolved into the military reforms without leaving a farewell. Other legions, such as Legio XV Apollinaris and Legio XII Fulminata, share similar shadows. They participated in campaigns in Armenia and Parthia, and were frequently mentioned in early texts. But after the 2nd century the trail fades. There is no evidence they were annihilated, yet no documentation confirms their restructuring. Some may have been broken into frontier units, others gradually blended into new formations. The process was so silent that history preserved only the first half of their story. Archaeology frequently uncovers armor fragments, helmets, stamped bricks, and personal items belonging to legions no longer found in the official rolls, scattered from the Danube to Syria, Judea, and Anatolia. These artifacts prove they lived there, fought there, stood guard along frontier walls, now reduced to ruins. Yet without administrative records, determining how they ended becomes nearly impossible. Roman history, often imagined as overwhelmingly detailed, sometimes contains gaps vast enough to swallow entire armies. What makes these legions remarkable is not their fame, but how their silent disappearances reveal the fragility of ancient record-keeping. A legion might exist for centuries, build cities, pave roads, guard vast borders, but a single reform, a discarded designation, or a campaign poorly recorded could turn them instantly into a name without an ending. The loss of these legions reminds us that not every historical story concludes with thunder. Some end quietly, through missing paperwork, layers of buried tiles, or fragments of armor worn thin by time. These shadows keep the study of Roman military history forever unfinished. Always room for another discovery, always questions that the past never bothered to answer. When we look at the Roman legions that disappeared, it's easy to imagine catastrophic battles, brutal ambushes, or shocking defeats recorded with horror in ancient texts. But the truth is broader, more complex, and sometimes so quiet that it leaves no trace on the page at all. A legion could go missing because of war, politics, reforms, natural disasters, or simply because the records were no longer maintained. The important point is this: not every event was recorded, and not every historian wanted to preserve their memory. The first and most obvious cause is war. The Teutoburg forest is the clearest example, where 3 legions were wiped out completely. In the east, campaigns against Parthia, Armenia, and especially the Bar Kokhba revolt were more than enough to erase a legion within weeks. When defeat meant political humiliation, the imperial court sometimes chose silence, erasing a legion's name from the rolls to avoid acknowledging an embarrassing loss. But many legions did not vanish because of battle. From the 3rd century onward, military reforms under Diocletian and Constantine shattered the old system. Legions were split, renumbered, or merged into new units. As strategies changed, legions that once held critical roles suddenly became redundant. They were not destroyed, they simply lost their names. And for modern historians, losing the name is essentially the same as disappearing. Internal politics was another major factor. A legion that supported the wrong faction in a civil war or was suspected of disloyalty could be dissolved simply because the emperor wanted to erase an unwelcome memory. Legio III Augusta suffered this fate, not because they lost a battle, but because they stood on the wrong side at the wrong time. Natural disasters also played their part. Earthquakes in Syria and Anatolia destroyed major encampments. When casualties were heavy and the region no longer held strategic value, the imperial government did not bother to reconstitute the legion. A collapsed fortress could be the first step toward the silence of an entire army. Declining record-keeping created its own shadows. During the 3rd century crisis, when provinces were lost, archives burned, and generals razed or dismissed troops without oversight. Many legions simply slipped out of the administrative system. A legion might appear in records in the year 230 of the Common Era and vanish after 260, not because it died, but because no one kept track anymore. In other cases, legions became absorbed into local life after centuries of garrison duty. As numbers dwindled, they turned into regional militias with no Roman centuria or cohort structure. Once the structure vanished, the Roman name vanished with it. And finally, there were the legions Rome wanted to disappear. A shameful defeat, a strategic blunder, or a symbolic loss, such as an eagle falling into enemy hands, could prompt the emperor to deliberately erase a legion's name, as if erasing it could erase the memory itself. All of this shows that the disappearance of Roman legions was not a mythical mystery, but the natural outcome of an empire in constant motion, always fighting, always reorganizing, always changing. The lost legions were victims of time, of reform, and of administrative pages that no longer had space to record every story. What makes the lost legions most captivating is not the moment they vanished, but the journey through which they are found again, sometimes because of nothing more than a shard of baked clay, a single shoe nail, or a fragment of armor that once seemed anonymous. Archaeology is a quiet conversation between humanity and the earth. Each tiny fragment lifted from the soil pulls with it the breath of a world long gone silent, and from these scattered traces, the fates of legions forgotten by history slowly come into view. One of the most important forms of evidence is stamped tiles. Many Roman legions mark their bricks, roof tiles, building materials, and even everyday objects with their official insignia. When a tile inscribed Leg Nui, Leg Zifera, or Leg 3 Aug appears within a layer of earth that can be reliably dated, it tells us far more than the location of a former camp. It reveals the period during which the legion was stationed there. What once seemed like an ordinary construction material becomes the most faithful, silent witness to a lost army. Another simple but powerful artifact is the cluster of Caligae nails. Roman soldiers reinforced their boots with iron studs for traction during long marches. When hundreds of these nails are found packed together in a single layer of soil, they recount moments no ancient writer ever described: a formation breaking apart, a desperate retreat, or a violent ambush. The dense groupings of shoe nails discovered at Calcraes not only confirm the site of the Teutoburg disaster, but also hint at scattered groups of soldiers cornered in dead ends, stories whispered through the silence of the ground. Weapons and armor tell a different kind of story, the story of final moments. A shield plate struck deeply can reveal the type of weapon used against the legion. A helmet crushed inward suggests the chaos and desperation of the battlefield. Helmets of Legio, 17th and 18th, have been found nearly flattened, the imprint of relentless Germanic blows in the Teutoburg forest. Meanwhile, armor fragments from Judea carry burns and shattering from stones, fire, and boiling oil, signs of siege warfare and urban revolt. Coins add yet another crucial clue. The emperor's face stamped on each coin provides precise dating. When multiple coins from the same era appear in a camp or along a marching route, they pinpoint the presence of a legion within a very specific window of time. In some cases, a single coin dropped from a soldier's pouch is enough to place an entire legion back onto the map. Equally important, are inscriptions carved into stone, listing officers, awards, construction projects, or notes about camp improvements. A monument mentioning a commander of Legio III Augusta, found at Lambasis, confirms the legion's long presence in North Africa. In Judea, inscriptions linked to Legio X Fretensis reveal their involvement in construction after Jerusalem's fall, a detail ancient texts barely mention. But perhaps most revealing of all are the remains of military camps, the spaces that let archaeology rebuild the daily life of an entire legion. Roman camps followed a familiar design: rectangular walls, divided zones, drill yards, bathhouses, armories, stables. When foundations of such structures are uncovered, we know instantly that we are standing in the living space of a legion that once guarded this land. At Megiddo, the massive workshop of Legio VI Ferrata proves that their title, Iron Ones, was not merely symbolic, but tied directly to their function. Finally, there are layers of soil filled with ash, bones, and personal belongings. A mass grave reveals the brutality of a legion's final stand. A patch of human remains mixed with small knives, rings, and identification tags evokes the panic of a sudden collapse. In Germania, many discoveries show legions attacked mid-march with no time to build a camp, perfectly matching the hit-and-run tactics of Germanic tribes. And from all these fragments emerges a simple truth: no legion ever disappears completely. Their names may vanish from the records, but the earth remembers. The ground does not speak, but it keeps everything. A small tile buried deep beneath the soil can bring an entire legion back onto the map after thousands of years. Thanks to archaeology, the story of the lost legions is no longer a loose collection of guesses. It becomes a grounded, tangible journey, assembled from clues so small they outlast every written page. And through these fragments, we reconnect threads that time once severed. The traces of the lost legions are not found only in shards of pottery, stamped bricks, or shoe nails lifted from the soil. They are also written into the geography where those legions once lived and died. Every frontier, every valley, every forest, every desert of the ancient Roman world holds a part of the story that written history never fully preserved. When we look at the map of Rome, we begin to see a pattern. There are lands that swallowed legions like darkness, lands that sheltered them for centuries, and lands that slowly blurred them into silence. Britannia is one of the brightest and darkest places when speaking of lost legions. This was where Legio IX Hispana left its final footprints, a fortified camp at York, traces of movement northward, and then absolute silence after the last recorded mention. Britannia was never a province Rome could fully grasp. The heavy mist, the cold forests, the stubborn tribes who fought relentlessly, all of it made the island a place where Roman discipline lost its edge. As Legio IX pushed farther north, they entered terrain where Roman tactics, so structured and orderly, gradually lost their advantage. Many scholars believe their disappearance was not a single dramatic battle, but a slow unraveling in a land Rome never truly understood. Today, crumbling walls, old brickwork, and scattered fragments remain like the last breaths of a legion that once stood among the empire's strongest. Germania, by contrast, tells a clearer, harsher, more merciless story. This was where Legio 17th, 18th, and 19th were devoured by the Teutoburg forest. Narrow paths, deep mud, heavy rain, and hidden trails known only to locals turn the region into a place where Roman discipline was stripped of its power. The brutality of northern German forests not only crushed 3 legions but forced Rome into decades of searching for the 3 stolen eagles. Discoveries at Calcries, shoe nails, crushed helmets, hacked armor, show that geography here was not just a backdrop, it was the Germanic warrior's greatest ally and Rome's most terrifying enemy. Farther east, Syria and Judea tell yet another story, one of urban revolt, religious tension, and ancient trade routes constantly targeted by hostile forces. This is where Legio VI Ferrata and Legio X Fretensis held their lines for generations. Syria lay on the border with Parthia and later the Sassanid Empire, a region constantly burning with conflict. Judea, with its dry hills, deep ravines, and cities built on stone ridges, was a place where even a small tactical error could shatter a Roman unit. Several legions disappeared from the records here, not because they were weak, but because the geography and the politics were more complex than any battlefield in Europe. North Africa, especially Numidia and Mauritania, brought a different kind of challenge. There were no Teutoburg forests here, no massive uprisings like Judea. Instead, there were deserts and endless plains where endurance, not tactics, decided survival. For centuries, Legio III Augusta guarded this frontier. The desert made territorial control difficult. Nomadic tribes could scatter like sand or gather like a storm. The legion became builders. Roads, watchtowers, fortresses, water systems. The geography of North Africa demanded that legions survive not through grand victories but through resilience and structure. When Rome reformed its military system, desert garrison legions like the Third Augusta were easily dissolved, their roles no longer fitting the new order. Then there was Asia Minor, Armenia, and Mesopotamia. Lands of high mountains, narrow valleys, and shifting deserts, where Rome and Parthia clashed for centuries but left surprisingly sparse written accounts. Many legions once stationed there, such as Legio XII Fulminata and 15th Apollinaris, gradually faded into the shadows of history. The harsh landscape meant even small failures could scatter a unit without leaving much trace. When we view these regions together, a simple but profound truth becomes clear. The fate of a legion is never separate from the land beneath its feet. Geography, forests, deserts, mountains, valleys, trails, climates silently shaped how long a legion survived, how strong it became, and ultimately where it vanished from history. Geography was never just the setting, it was a central character in the story of Rome's lost legions, a quiet character but powerful enough to decide the destiny of armies that once built an empire. When people think of the Roman legions, they often imagine rows of shields glittering under the sun, horns echoing across valleys, and battles stretching across 3 continents. But behind that glory and iron discipline were ordinary men, legionaries living inside a world so small only they truly understood it, where every day existed on the thin line between duty, hope, and quiet fear. To understand a legion, we must understand the soldiers who built it, because a legion was never born from myth, but from thousands of lives breathing in the same rhythm. A legionary usually began his military life at 18 or 20. He left behind his home, perhaps a poor village in central Italy, a coastal town in Gaul, or a remote valley in the Balkans, to enter a community where everyone wore the same colors, shaved the same way, held the same shield, and slept in rooms identical to one another. For many, joining the legion was not about glory, but about survival and opportunity, steady pay, reliable food, and after 20 years of service, a piece of land to start life again. But a soldier's life was never simple. Their day began before the sun rose. They trained with armor, shields, and weapons, weighing dozens of kilograms, marched for miles, built camps, dug ditches, hauled timber, and repaired roads. A weak legionary was quickly left behind and punished. There was no room for slowness or idleness. Every man had to become part of a machine that never stopped moving. Today, the bone marks found on excavated skeletons, shoulders worn from carrying shields, spines compressed from heavy loads, are the silent legacy of that life. When they were not on the march, Roman soldiers lived in a repetitive rhythm of construction and watch duty, raising walls, digging canals, building forts, patrolling borders. In truth, a Roman legion spent far more time building than fighting. The straight roads, square fortresses, and routes carved through mountains and plains, all were the handiwork of these soldiers. They were the foundation of Romanization, even though their names were never carved into stone. Yet within that strict, grueling life existed a private spiritual world seldom mentioned in historical texts. Legionaries carried small charms, a stone from home, a Medusa talisman for protection, a piece of metal etched with lucky symbols. In camp, they played dice, shared travel stories, and sang old songs from their homelands. Letters from home were passed around like treasures, and the entire barracks fell silent whenever a man opened one to read a few precious lines. But alongside discipline and endurance always lived fear, a fear that never left them, not for a single day. The fear of dying in an unfamiliar land where no one would remember their name. The fear of being wounded and abandoned during a nighttime retreat. The fear of illness in a strange climate. When a legionary watched a friend fall, or heard that a legion somewhere across the empire had been erased, he understood how fragile his own fate truly was. And it is this fragility that makes the story of the lost legions so profound. When a legion disappears from the historical record, it is not just administrative silence, it is thousands of untold lives, thousands of footsteps across deserts, forests, and mountains, dissolving into a darkness that history never returned to. The life of a legionary reveals that a legion was its own society with discipline, routines, small joys, and immense fears. By understanding them, we understand why some legions are well recorded while others survive only as names swept away by the winds of time. A legion truly disappears only when we forget the men who lived, fought, and hoped within it. And telling their stories is how we bring them back. When we look at the map of Rome stretching across the centuries, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The empire's borders were never still. They expanded and contracted, advanced and then retreated, like the long breathing of a giant living body. And that rhythm decided the fate of countless legions. Some were born to attack, others were built to guard the frontier, and some simply vanished because the border they defended shifted somewhere else. Whenever Rome changed its strategic direction, legions that once stood at the tip of the spear suddenly became names with no purpose left to serve. Under Augustus, Rome's borders were full of ambition. The empire reached into Germania, Britannia, Armenia, and pressed close to Parthia. It was an age of expansion when legions like the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 9th Hispana were created to break into new lands, impose order, and force local tribes into submission. But expanding borders were more fragile than any defensive line. A single ambush, a misjudgment, or a governor who misunderstood the threat could erase an entire legion in a matter of days. So when Rome's ambitions later tightened, these assault legions were the first to vanish from the rolls, not because they were weak, but because the world around them had changed. By the 2nd century, under Trajan and Hadrian, Rome's frontier policy reversed. Trajan pushed deep into Mesopotamia but could not hold it. Hadrian chose to pull back, drawing firm, deliberate lines. This was the age of defense. Hadrian's wall in Britannia, the long limes along the Rhine and Danube, and fortresses stretching like stitching meant to hold the empire together. In that context, offensive legions became unnecessary. There were no new lands to seize, and maintaining them cost too much. Many legions were moved inland, dissolved, or merged into new units. Rome never kept a legion that no longer fit the strategic rhythm of its era. In the 3rd century, age of chaos, the borders shifted again, but this time sharply inward. Goths, Alemanni, Sarmatians, and Parthians attacked relentlessly, forcing the empire to contract around its most vital territories. As the eastern border withdrew from Mesopotamia back to Syria, many legions in Armenia and along the Euphrates suddenly stood in a no-man's land. And when the territory they guarded no longer belonged to Rome, the legions themselves no longer had a reason to exist. The 22nd Deotariana, the 12th Fulminata, the 15th Apollinaris, and many others faded from the record like they dissolved into the lands they once defended. Under Diocletian and Constantine, Rome restructured its army once again. The empire adopted a two-tiered system: the limitanae, border troops stationed permanently in fortresses, and the comitatenses, mobile forces ready to move wherever needed. This transformation fragmented many traditional legions, scattering them across forts along the frontier. A name once carrying imperial prestige could shrink into a small outpost unit of a few hundred men guarding a remote crossing. Administrative records no longer used the old legionary titles, and thus a legion disappeared not through defeat, but because the empire restructured itself until there was no place left for it. There were also regions Rome was forced to abandon entirely, like Dacia or parts of northern Britannia. When that happened, the garrison legions had to withdraw in haste, merged into other units, or disbanded along the march. The records never captured these details. Sometimes all that remains is a short note saying withdrawn, followed by a complete silence. The disappearance of many Roman legions, then, is not a tale of swords and burning cities, but a story of movement. A legion could stand in glory one day and become obsolete the next, simply because the border shifted elsewhere. They did not vanish overnight. They were slowly erased through each small change on the map. And when the world changed pace, those legions drifted with it, quietly stepping off the stage of history. No horns, no tragedy, just one more shift in an empire that once stretched too far. When we imagine the disappearance of a Roman legion, we often picture the clash of steel, broken ranks collapsing in a forest, or a massive ambush that wipes out an entire army. But history holds quieter endings. Some legions did not fall to enemies at all, but to forces far more invisible: disease, natural disaster, famine, administrative breakdown, and very human mistakes. These names carry no grand tragedy. They simply faded into silence, leaving behind a kind of emptiness even harder to define than a battlefield defeat. disease was one of those silent destroyers. The Roman Empire was shaken by several major pandemics, such as the Antonine Plague in the late 2nd century or the Cyprian Plague in the 3rd, waves that killed hundreds of thousands. In a packed military camp where thousands of soldiers lived shoulder to shoulder, disease spread so quickly that a legion could collapse in weeks. Large bases in Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia, hubs of trade with constant movement of people, were especially vulnerable. If a legion lost more than half its strength, Rome often chose to dissolve or merge it rather than rebuild. And so a name could vanish from history simply because of pathogens no one could see. Natural disasters brought similar endings, just as quiet. Devastating earthquakes in Asia Minor and Syria during antiquity destroyed entire forts in moments. When a major camp was buried, its structures shattered, and the region no longer held strategic value, the imperial administration often allowed the legion to fade with its ruins. Legio VI Ferrata may have slipped into history this way: a powerful quake, a collapsed base, and a disappearance that began not with an enemy's spear, but with the shaking of the earth. Sometimes nature did not need to be violent at all. Drought, poor harvests, or shortages of water could break a garrison just as effectively. Desert camps in North Africa were particularly vulnerable. A single year of drought could empty storage, forcing soldiers to scatter to nearby towns. If the state no longer prioritized regrouping them, the legion simply thinned out, like a stream drying under a hot wind. But some disappearances were quieter still, born from administrative errors. Rome was famous for its detailed record-keeping, but that did not mean everything was flawless. Civil wars, new emperors, and the eventual shift of the capital to Constantinople all caused documents to be lost, altered, or never updated. Some legions vanished from lists simply because the final record was misplaced. When they did not appear in later deployment orders, modern historians interpreted their absence as lost, though in reality they might have been absorbed into other forces. Then there were the deeply human factors, the moments when a legion's fate depended on fragile decisions. A weak commander, a march made in the wrong direction, or a chaotic retreat could break a unit apart, scattering soldiers into small groups with no ability to reorganize. A legion did not always die in battle. Sometimes it died in confusion, moments too small or too embarrassing for history to bother recording. Many legions also disappeared because they no longer had enough men to be called a legion. Units on distant frontiers in Dacia, Arabia, Numidia were constantly split into detachments for minor tasks. Over time, they dwindled into scattered groups guarding isolated forts. No more centuria, no more cohorts, no legate. When the structure dissolved, the name dissolved with it, drifting away like a final exhale. And then there was another reason. Quiet, but more powerful than all the rest. The empire's indifference. When a region lost importance, when trade routes shifted, when the frontier moved, the imperial government simply stopped caring what happened to the legion stationed there. They might be moved, merged, abandoned, or never mentioned again in any surviving document. An empire too vast sometimes forgot the very soldiers who had carried it for generations. And that is how many Roman legions died, not in the shouting of battle, but in the absolute silence of time, disease, climate, and small, relentless changes. These legions did not disappear because they were defeated. They disappeared because they were forgotten. When we speak of the lost legions, people often focus on the traces they left behind: a collapsed camp, a layer of burned ash, or a final line in a document that stops mid-sentence. But behind every legion, whether it vanished in battle or dissolved into silence, stands the shadow of its commanders. They were the ones who shaped the fates of thousands of soldiers, the ones who could lead a legion to glory, or push it into the abyss with a single wrong decision. A legion could be strong, disciplined, and battle-hardened. But if its leader failed to understand the rhythm of the land beneath their feet, everything could collapse. Varus, Deiotarus, and countless nameless commanders are the turning points in this story. Varus, the name forever tied to the disaster of Teutoburg, is the clearest example of how one wrong decision can destroy everything. He was not considered incompetent by Roman standards. In fact, he had governed Syria, was respected for his understanding of law, and known for being firm and administratively capable. But those very qualities became his burden when he faced Germania, a land where Roman law meant nothing. Varus looked at forests, storms, swamps, and unpredictable tribes with the eyes of a bureaucrat, not a general. He trusted Arminius with naive confidence, trusted a man who grew up in the Roman army but remained a Germanic chieftain at heart. And because he trusted the wrong person, Varus marched 3 legions, in the 17th, 18th, and 19th, as if conducting a tax inspection, with no caution, no proper formation, and no scouting units. That mistake did not just ruin a campaign when it killed more than 20,000 men in the Teutoburg forest and turned his name into a symbol of how blind confidence can cripple an entire empire. If Varus was the tragedy of misplaced trust, then Deiotarus was the tragedy of blurred lines between ambition and loyalty. He was not Roman, yet became one of Rome's most valuable allies during the chaotic final years of the Republic. His personal army, the force that later became Legio 22nd Deiotarana, carried within it the turbulent history of a small kingdom caught between great powers. Driven by the desire to protect his throne, Deiotarus switched sides more than once, from Pompey to Caesar, then seeking protection under Augustus. When his army was absorbed into the Roman system, it became an official legion, but its roots remained those of a local force shaped by royal command, not Roman military doctrine. This hybrid identity made the 22nd both unique and vulnerable, strong when used in the right context, but standing outside the main political currents of Rome. And when the legion disappeared from the records, one cannot help but wonder whether their origins made them easier to abandon when crisis struck. Yet Varus and Deiotarus are merely 2 names history chose to preserve. Behind them stand countless other commanders, seldom mentioned yet holding the fate of entire legions in their hands. In Judea, a land constantly strained by religious and ethnic conflict, a governor lacking restraint could push a legion into situations they were never built to withstand. One overly harsh decision could ignite rebellion. One overly lenient stance could empower resistance. In either case, legions like the 10th Fretensis became the shield absorbing the consequences. The ashes of Jerusalem, Masada, and the ruined fortresses of the Bar Kokhba revolt still bear the marks of such hidden decisions, mistakes no one ever recorded by name. In North Africa, where the desert erases all footprints, a commander misjudging water supplies could doom hundreds of soldiers before they ever saw an enemy. The desert does not attack, it simply waits. And when a legion scattered from exhaustion, The imperial administration considered it too depleted to rebuild. They vanished not because they lost a battle, but because they lost to the desert. In the 3rd century, as the empire spiraled into endless civil wars, many legions were dragged into the ambitions of generals who declared themselves emperor. A legion backing the wrong claimant could be punished by dissolution immediately after the revolt failed. They were not killed by enemies beyond the frontier, but by the greed of their own leaders. These stories reveal a truth. A legion was never only the victim of geography or battle. It was also the victim of power, a force that could raise it up or erase it with a single order. In the shadows of mistakes, schemes, ambition, ignorance, or misguided confidence, many Roman legions were pushed into the void of history. And thousands of years later, when we trace their footsteps, we do not see only fragments of armor and stamped bricks. We see the human decisions that made them disappear. When a Roman legion vanishes from the record, the first question that rises is always the same. What did their final moments look like? Was it the clash of steel against shields, the howl of forest winds spiraling through panic, or the heavy silence of an exhausted army collapsing into desert sand? Some legions died in battles that shook the empire, others unraveled quietly in places no historian ever bothered to write about. These last moments, pieced together from archaeology, scattered fragments and layers of earth that remember when people do not, are mirrors reflecting the instant when history went silent. The Teutoburg forest is the clearest example of an ending crushed from start to finish. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions were not merely defeated. They were swallowed by a landscape they never understood. Marching into the narrow forest path, they moved as if on routine patrol, failing to build a camp, failing to question their guide Arminius. The soil at Calcres tells a story quieter than the texts, but far more brutal. Piles of shoe nails, helmets crushed flat, broken spearheads scattered everywhere, signs of an army cornered into a choke point and struck from both sides. No formation, no tactics, no escape. Their last sound was not the drum of war, but the German woods closing behind them, drowning 3 legions in its silence. In Britannia, the fate of Legio IX Hispana, though still debated, carries the weight of an unspoken tragedy. If they disappeared in the northern mists, as many theories suggest, their final battle unfolded in thick fog amid treacherous marshland against Caledonian warriors who fought in ways Rome never fully understood. Charred fort foundations, layers of ash beneath the soil, and unmarked graves near York hint at a conflict larger than any written account. If the 9th Hispana was erased here, it was not a defeat sung by historians. It was a quiet vanishing, recorded only in cold earth rather than ink. In Judea, the ending of Legio XXII Deotariana, if it truly occurred during the Bar Kokhba revolt, may have been one of the most harrowing. This was not a battlefield of open plains. It was a maze of tunnels, stone ramparts, burning towns, and narrow ravines where Jewish rebels fought to the final breath. Charred armor fragments, distinctive Jewish arrowheads, and rebel coins bearing the name Simon Bar Kokhba, found alongside Roman military objects, paint a picture of a war where both sides were pushed beyond exhaustion. If the 22nd died here, they did not fall in a single clash. They were worn down over weeks of encirclement, assault, and dwindling supplies. In North Africa, Legio III Augusta experienced a different kind of ending. one without a single defining battle. They were drained by years of small Berber uprisings and endless marches across desert routes where water and shade were rarer than enemies. When an earthquake shattered their headquarters and civil war weakened the frontier network, the legion dispersed. There was no clear final day, only scattered groups of soldiers swallowed by chaos. It was the quietest death of all. A legion not destroyed but thinned until it vanished. Some legions disappeared after battles that were never recorded at all. Mass graves discovered in Armenia, Syria, or along the Danube contain the remains of hundreds of Roman soldiers with no inscriptions, no insignia, no clues to their unit. That could be the final resting place of a legion that survived for centuries. Yet without documents, they become the anonymous legions, known only through bones, not through names. What makes these final battles remarkable is not their scale or ferocity, but the sense that we are witnessing the moment a legion stepped out of history. Not every ending was written down, not every loss was remembered, but the ground where they fell, whether forest, marshland, desert, or ruined city, remembers a part of the truth. And when we piece those traces together, we realize that history is not only a story of victories, but also a story of silences, the blank spaces where light never had a chance to reach. When a Roman legion disappeared, it was never just a military event. It was a shockwave spreading outward like ripples across water, from lonely frontier watchtowers to the marble halls of the Senatus in Rome, from bustling provincial cities to the small villages tucked deep inside the countryside. A legion was not only a fighting unit, it was a symbol of strength, a promise that the empire could stand against any threat. And when that symbol collapsed, Rome faced more than a loss of manpower. It faced a fracture in its sense of itself. The days following the destruction of a legion were the days Rome was forced to look inward and ask, where was the weakness? When did the failure begin? And how could the empire stop itself from falling into a chain reaction? The first response was always fear. News travelled slowly in the ancient world, but silence was more terrifying than any report of defeat. When envoys failed to return, when frontier camps stopped sending updates, the Romans understood that something catastrophic had happened. The days after the Teutoburg disaster are the clearest example. Upon learning that 3 legions had vanished, Augustus was said to have struck his head against the wall and cried out in anguish, "Varus, give me back my legions!" It was not merely anger toward Varus, it was the grief of a man realizing that the order of the entire empire had cracked. Then came the urgent task of patching the breach. The loss of a legion meant that part of the frontier had become dangerously thin. Rome had to pull troops from elsewhere, triggering a chain of strategic reshuffling across the empire. After Legio IX Hispana disappeared from Britannia, Rome was forced to bring Legio VI Victrix from Germania, a move that reshaped the entire defensive strategy in the north. After Teutoburg, the provinces of Germania had to be reorganized from the ground up, and Rome abandoned its dream of conquering the region forever. Next came inquiries and punishment. Any commander suspected of incompetence, negligence, or disloyalty could be removed, exiled, or executed. A lost legion was not only a military failure, it was a failure of leadership and reputation. Legio III Augusta was once dissolved not because it lost a battle, but because it stood on the wrong side of a rebellion in North Africa. In the Roman Empire, loyalty could matter more than victory. Then came the concealment. Rome was a master of controlling its own narrative. Defeats that threatened imperial legitimacy were often softened or erased. Some legions did not vanish because they left no trace. They vanished because the imperial court chose to remove them from the official story. This is why certain legions abruptly stop appearing in records, not because they were destroyed, but because Rome preferred history to forget them. After the crisis came reconstruction. The empire needed borders, and borders needed soldiers. New legions were raised, or troops were relocated from other provinces. Recruits were drawn from Italia, Gaul, Thrace, Dalmatia, anywhere with enough manpower. But a reformed legion could never fully replace one that had existed for centuries. Its experience, its traditions, its collective spirit, all of it vanished, and no number of fresh recruits could recreate it. The social consequences spread just as widely. When a legion disappeared, thousands of families never received a body or a full explanation. All they received was a cold message, not returning. For them, a lost legion was not a historical puzzle. It was a wound, an absence that lingered across generations. That grief seeped into the population, forcing the government to offer compensation, increase public messaging, or hold ceremonial honors to keep unrest from spreading. But the deepest impact was psychological. Rome endured for so long largely because it believed in its own invincibility. When a legion vanished, especially on a distant frontier, that belief cracked. The empire entered more cautious phases, building more walls, reinforcing more fortresses, and scaling back the expansionist ambitions that had once defined its golden age. The loss of a single legion did not just weaken a border, it reshaped the empire's understanding of its own strength. And in the end, after every decision was made, every frontier adjusted, and every reassurance delivered, Rome still had to confront a truth it could never erase. When a legion disappeared, a piece of the empire disappeared with it. Not just soldiers, but memory, honor, and a fragment of Rome's power slipping quietly into the dark. To us today, a lost legion feels like a mystery, a half-open doorway in history, inviting us to step closer for an answer. But to the ancient Romans, the disappearance of a legion was not a legend. It was a fracture, a warning, a sign that something sacred, something believed to be unshakable, had begun to tremble. When we look at how the Romans reacted to a legion that never returned, we see an entire worldview laid bare, their ideas of honor, discipline, the gods, and the fragile nature of an empire they believed would last forever. For the Roman soldier, a legion was a family. They began their military life at 18 or 20, living with the same comrades in the barracks, sharing rations, building bridges, digging trenches, marching, fighting, kiddie for 20 years. They knew each other's faces, voices, hometowns, who came from Gaul, who from Italia, who carried a charm from the Balkans. So when news came that a legion had been wiped out, the loss was not just numerical, it was personal. It was the loss of a community. And that feeling sent a quiet fear straight into every soldier's heart. If it happened to them, it could happen to us. For commanders and officials, the disappearance of a legion was proof of failure. Not only the failure of a campaign, but a failure within the Roman order itself. A legion represented perfect discipline. When it collapsed, it meant something had gone wrong. Flawed strategy, faulty intelligence, poor leadership, or worse, betrayal. It is no coincidence that Varus's disaster in the Teutoburg forest cast a long shadow over Augustus's reign. To the ruling class, each lost legion was a strike against their own authority. For ordinary citizens, the story was different. They lived in a culture that celebrated victory, where every square, triumphal arch and coin proclaimed the empire's invincibility. So when they heard that a legion, the symbol of Rome, had been erased, they were not merely confused, they were unsettled. To them, such news was an omen, a sign of divine anger, or evidence of weakness the government tried to hide. Great defeats were often softened or erased in official records, not only to protect politics, but to protect the public's belief in the empire's eternal strength. Among administrators, a lost legion meant political danger. A governor, a general, even a high-ranking centurion could lose their position, their fortune, or their life if the Senate or the emperor believed they were responsible. This created a chain reaction, cautious reports, vague documentation, or the quiet removal of certain details. These acts of self-protection left the very gaps that we now call lost legions. On a deeper cultural level, the disappearance of a legion carried religious weight. Every legion marched under its Aquila, the sacred eagle of Jupiter. When an enemy captured the eagle, it was a grave insult. To the Romans, losing an Aquila meant Jupiter had turned away. It is no surprise that many campaigns after Teutoburg were launched solely to recover the lost eagles. These were not just military missions, they were rituals meant to restore divine favor. But as the empire entered the turbulent 3rd century, with civil wars, invasions, and shifting borders, this perception began to change. A disappearing legion was no longer an unthinkable catastrophe. It became part of the normal chaos of the era. Romans no longer viewed the legion list as fixed. They grew accustomed to units being split, reorganized, renamed, or erased altogether, pieces of a game board that never stopped moving. This shift in understanding paved the way for the new military system under Constantine, where traditional legions were gradually replaced by smaller, more mobile units. Old names faded, old emblems dimmed, and the legions that had once been Rome's pride began to drift into the past, just as the empire itself was preparing to transform into something new. All of this reveals a simple truth. The Roman view of a lost legion was never only about war, it was about fear, belief, power, and the shifting consciousness of an empire that once imagined itself eternal. When a legion vanished, Rome saw in it a reflection of its own nature, complex, fragile, and forever poised between glory and collapse. To understand the deepest pain behind the disappearance of a Roman legion, we have to begin with the symbol they carried, the Aquila, the eagle. In the Roman world, a legion was not defined by the number of its soldiers or the shine of its armor. It was defined by its soul, and that soul was the Aquila. When the eagle fell into enemy hands, the legion was considered dead, even if survivors remained. And when the Aquila was lost, the honor of the entire army was buried under the soil of history. The Aquila was not a piece of decorative metal. It was treated as a living, sacred presence, an immortal soldier of the legion. It always marched at the front, always held the center, always entrusted to the bravest and most loyal man, the Aquilifer, the bearer of the eagle. It was a position of glory, but also a position of near-certain death. Enemies aimed for the Aquilifer first, because once the eagle fell, the legion's morale collapsed immediately. The Romans understood this so deeply that protecting the Aquila mattered more than protecting themselves. That is why, when a legion was defeated and its eagle taken, the loss was no longer a military failure. It was a sacrilege. After the Teutoburg disaster, Rome's greatest agony was not just that 3 legions had been wiped out. It was that 3 eagles had been stolen. Tiberius and Germanicus launched entire campaigns not to capture land or crush their enemies, but simply to recover the eagles. And when even one Aquila was brought home, Rome held celebrations as grand as a miniature triumph. The symbol carried more weight than the battlefield itself. Because of this, the fate of lost legions is always tied to the fate of their eagles. Legio XIX is the most painful example. Their Aquila vanished for years, hidden as the ultimate trophy among the Germanic tribes. When it was finally recovered, every man who had once served under it was long gone. For Legio Nona Hispana, no Aquila has ever been found, an unsettling void, as if the legion dissolved before they could even form up to protect their symbol. The absence of the eagle makes their story dimmer, more uncertain, and thus even more mysterious. For the ordinary legionary, the Aquila was not just sacred. It was the thread that bound them to something greater than their own lives. When a soldier joined the legion, he swore an oath to the emperor, but also to the eagle. It was a vow never to be broken. In the Aquila, they saw Jupiter standing beside them. They saw Rome made eternal. They saw themselves belonging to a force larger than all the fears they carried in their hearts. Because of that, losing the Aquila did not just destroy formation, it destroyed faith. Ancient records describe survivors who could not bear the guilt and ended their own lives on the battlefield, believing they had let the eagle die in their hands. The Aquila became the ultimate measure of honor. A legion was truly considered alive only as long as its eagle still soared, and once the eagle disappeared, even if men survived, the legion was regarded as dead. This is why when a legion vanishes from the historical record, the first question historians ask is, where is the Aquila? If it is nowhere to be found, the legion may have been swallowed by chaos. If it rests in enemy territory, they likely fought until the last breath. And if the eagle lies buried in the earth, waiting to be uncovered, it means the soul of that legion is sleeping beneath the layers of time. To the Romans, the Aquila was the beating heart of the legion. When that heart stopped, history called it lost. And when that heart is found again, even as a corroded fragment of metal, the legion steps out of the shadows, if only for a moment, to be remembered by the name they carried through their entire journey. One of the most captivating things about the lost legions is this. Sometimes we only think we know when they disappeared until a tiny object is lifted from the soil and the entire story suddenly shifts. Archaeology works like a silent time machine. It does not rebuild the past through legend or speculation, but through brick, through iron, through scratches left on metal. And just one small fragment can shake what humanity has believed for centuries. The most famous example is Legio Nona Hispana. For generations it was accepted that this legion was wiped out in Britannia after the years 108 to 120 of the Common Era, the victims of a northern uprising. But then a small inscription in Nijmegen in the Netherlands surfaced, bearing the words Legni Hisp. Just one stone, yet enough to change everything. The ninth was not destroyed in Britannia after all. part of the legion or one of its subunits, continued to exist later on. That single detail opened up an entirely new question, heavy and unresolved. Where did they really vanish, and why? The question remains open today, reminding us that history is never a finished story. The story of Legio 17, 18, and 19 only became clear when archaeology spoke. Before Calcrease was excavated, many scholars doubted Tacitus's description of Teutoburg, but then layers of hobnails stacked on top of each other, crushed helmets, snapped spearheads, and the remains of a wooden defensive line confirmed everything. A helmet split by a blade, a sword bent into an unnatural curve. Each tiny detail matched the account of a multi-day ambush in deep forest. Archaeology revealed not only that the 3 legions were destroyed, but how they died, step by step, pushed into chaos until the Germanic forest closed behind them. Legio 6 Ferrata was found again in a similar way. When the Megiddo camp was excavated in the 21st century, a massive workshop and bricks stamped Legzifer were uncovered. Suddenly, their title ironclad felt more literal than ever. They were not just a fighting legion, they were the repair and armory center of the entire eastern frontier. These discoveries explain why they lasted so long, and why they disappeared after an earthquake destroyed their base. They were not cut down in battle, they were undone by time and nature. At Lambasis, the fortress of Legio III Augusta, hundreds of artifacts were unearthed: officer inscriptions, bathhouse foundations, training grounds, arsenals, and civilian structures that grew outward from the military base. These fragments reveal the everyday life of a legion that endured for centuries, and through them their disappearance, caused by political restructuring rather than war, becomes far easier to understand. They were not a mystery, they were casualties of an aging empire reorganizing itself. Another discovery left scholars stunned: a small Egyptian inscription naming a centurion of Legio 22 Deotariana, dated after the time the legion was believed to have vanished. Just one line of text, yet enough to reopen every question. Was the 22nd truly destroyed in the Bar Kokhba revolt, or did part of it survive? Was it broken apart, absorbed, or simply misfiled in the chaos of administrative change? A single stone proved more powerful than 100 academic theories. The deeper archaeologists dig, the more they realize that many legions did not die in the grand dramatic battles we imagine. They dissolved slowly from hunger, isolation, abandonment, or because the empire's priorities shifted elsewhere. Abandoned camps in Syria, cracked walls in Arabia, unfinished bricks scattered along the Danube. All of them tell a very different story. Sometimes a legion does not die in a single flash, but in the slow exhaustion of an era. And here is the strangest part: the deeper we dig, the clearer it becomes that no legion ever vanished completely. They only vanished from imperial paperwork. In the earth, they are still there, stubborn, silent, and far more enduring than any ancient text. A brick, a spearhead, a fallen wall. Each one is proof of a unit that truly lived. Archaeology does not give us the whole story, but it restores something more important: the people within that story. And perhaps that is the most honest way for the lost legions to step out of the shadows and into the light once more. Nothing fuels a legend more powerfully than silence, and the disappearance of a Roman legion is the purest silence of all. When thousands of men march into a forest, a swamp, or a desert and never return, that void becomes fertile ground for human imagination. The ancients filled that space with myth. Later generations filled it with theory. And sometimes those stories outlived the truth itself. Among them, Legio Ni Hispana is the greatest legend of all. For centuries, Europeans believed the ninth was swallowed by the mists of Britannia, a legion that marched into the north and dissolved into the pale, icy fog. Folk tales said they were ambushed by Caledonian warriors hidden in the mist, or dragged into bottomless bogs. The image became so powerful that it turned into a symbol, Britannia as a black maw ready to consume any Roman force. Even when archaeology later uncovered signs that the ninth may have left Britannia and vanished elsewhere, the legend refused to fade, because it was never built on fact, but on the eerie feeling of a disappearance too complete to explain. The myth of Teutoburg carries the same energy. The Germanic peoples told stories of Roman spirits wandering the woods, unable to find their way home because the forest itself rejected them. These tales turned the northern woods into a sacred realm where past and present intertwined. The Romans, too, reinforced the legend by describing Germania as a land beyond taming, a place where even the gods seemed to stand with the mountains and trees. In this case, myth was crafted not to explain the defeat, but to soften it, to suggest that if Rome lost, it was only because it faced a force larger than human understanding. In North Africa, the myths take the shape of sand. People told stories that part of Legio III Augusta marched too far into the Sahara and became the Legion of Sand, ghostly figures wandering forever among the dunes, dissolving into the desert wind. There is no evidence for this, yet when Roman forts were found buried deep under layers of sand, belief in the legend only grew. The desert has always been a place where things vanish, and it is easy to believe a legion might vanish with it. One of the strangest stories comes from the East. Some legends claim that Roman survivors were enslaved, carried far away, and eventually appeared in a battle between the Han Chinese and the Xiongnu. The idea that a Roman-style formation once fought in ancient China has almost no hard evidence, yet the allure of the idea keeps it alive. People love imagining a lost legion living out a secret life, dying in a land Rome never even knew existed. Many myths were shaped by ancient historians themselves, writers who preferred dramatic tragedy to mundane truth. Some exaggerated the savagery of Rome's enemies, others embellished battles to turn defeat into tragic heroism. But sometimes the truth is painfully ordinary. A legion dissolved because of disease, because water ran out, or because a commander made a very human mistake. But such truths are rarely dramatic enough to endure. Legend, with all its exaggeration, has a stronger pulse. We also cannot ignore the stories born from personal grief. Families of missing soldiers often created their own explanations, that their loved ones were betrayed, abandoned, or met a glorious fate somewhere far away. These stories are not history. They are attempts to protect the final image of someone who never came home. They may be fantastical, but they carry the truth of emotion. And ultimately, what nourishes these legends most is fear, both theirs and ours. A vanished legion is a reminder that Rome was not immortal, that even the greatest system of the ancient world had cracks that could not be sealed. But humans struggle to accept the collapse of something so seemingly perfect. So they create stories, miracles, and whispers, ways to turn the terrifying into something imaginable. These legends do not reflect the truth, they reflect the people telling them. and in that sense they have become inseparable from the tale of the lost legions, where fact and myth blend together like two faces of the same shadow. When a Roman legion disappears from the record, people often assume their story ends there, a final line in a chronicle, a cold, quiet, full stop. But no legion ever truly vanishes. They simply change shape, change meaning, shifting from a marching formation into something far more enduring and far more subtle, woven into the way humans build, organize, and understand the world. Their disappearance is not an ending, it is a transformation, and the legacy they leave behind is sometimes deeper than any victory they ever claimed on the battlefield. The most visible legacy lies in the roads they carved across the world. Every legion sent to the distant edges of the empire had to build roads, raise forts, and throw bridges over rivers. The forest roads of Germania, the iron-hard desert corridors of North Africa, and the perfectly straight routes of Britannia all bear the fingerprints of men once thought to have been swallowed by history. Even after the legions themselves faded from existence, their roads lived on, carrying merchants, migrants, and later armies across the same land. The legions disappeared as people, but the physical traces they left behind continued shaping the world for centuries. Another legacy, less tangible yet far more influential, appears in the way Rome reorganized its military in later centuries. When many legions were erased from the rolls during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Rome was forced to rethink its entire strategy, no longer depending on massive offensive forces, but shifting towards smaller, more flexible units, better suited to a chaotic world. The disappearance of the old legions became the catalyst for reforms that led to Constantine's two-tier system, the Limitanei guarding the borders, and the Comitatenses moving swiftly through the interior. That structure became the blueprint for medieval European warfare. In other words, the gap left behind by the lost legions opened the door to an entirely new military era. A third legacy, quiet, steady, and profound, lies in the realization of how fragile power truly is. A civilization that once believed itself invincible had to confront the truth that even its finest legions could be erased by disease, weather, human error, or forces entirely outside its control. Their disappearance served as a reminder that every power, no matter how proud, has its blind spots. It forced Rome and us to look at the past with a humbler gaze. Their legacy also lives on in the way we tell stories. Without the silent death of Legio IX Hispana, we would not have the legends of soldiers walking into fog and fading from the world. Without Teutoburg, we would not have one of history's great tales of arrogance and the cost of underestimating the unfamiliar. Without the dissolution of legions in Judea, North Africa, or Armenia, we would never fully grasp the complexity of Rome's frontiers. Their mysteries became fuel for imagination, a kind of energy that exists only when history leaves a blank space. Yet perhaps the most enduring, most human legacy lies in the people themselves. Lost legions were not just thousands of soldiers, they were thousands of lives, young men leaving small villages to step into the empire, carrying charms from home, hopes for the future, and faith in the Aquila. When they disappear, we are reminded that a legion is never a faceless machine. It is a community of human beings bound together for 20 long years. To understand them is not just to solve a historical puzzle, but to return a voice to those forgotten lives. Their legacy also survives in the small things time could not erase, A brick stamped leg 9, a broken spearhead, a coin dropped along a march route, a dented fragment of armor. These objects outlast the rosters of emperors and the names of the men who once held them. Each time one is unearthed, it pulls the legion back out of the shadows, giving them a presence more real, more tangible than any written record ever could. And finally, the legacy of the lost legions rests in the very idea of lost. It reminds us that history is not complete, that vast stretches of the past remain unlit, that some stories survive only through fragments. Our task is not to fill every gap, but to respect them, to recognize that the ancient world was larger, messier, and more human than anything left on parchment. The lost legions did not just leave behind roads, forts, or legends. They left behind a way of seeing the past as storytellers, as seekers, and as people trying to understand the world more deeply. When we close the story of Rome's lost legions, we begin to see that what keeps them alive in human memory is not victory, nor perfect records, nor glorious chronicles. Many of these legions left behind almost nothing: no triumphal arches, no poets to praise them, no carved dates of victory on stone, and in many cases not even a clear place where their journey ended. And yet, across thousands of years, people still speak of them, still search for them, still feel a strange tremor in their chest when they hear those fading names. Perhaps it is because the nature of history has always belonged to what remains unfinished. The silences, the gaps, the stories that cut off mid-sentence invite us to listen more closely, think more deeply, and ask far more questions. The lost legions are the embodiment of these darkened spaces. They do not leave behind answers, but they leave behind a space to keep asking. And sometimes that space has more power than any text could ever offer. They also remind us that even an empire as mighty as Rome, an empire that once believed itself eternal, was fragile before nature, disease, forests, deserts, and the missteps of human judgment. They show that strength is not found in being undefeatable, but in recognizing the limits of one's own power. Without these missing legions, we might too easily believe that history is simply a chain of victories by great empires, but their disappearance exposes a deeper truth. No empire is immune to time. Within those legions that never returned were countless individuals whose names were never recorded. History often chooses to honor the generals, the emperors, the victorious. But the vanishing of the legions shines a light back upon the ordinary soldiers, young men from distant villages carrying charms from their mothers, marching through dense forests, building camps on cold frontiers, only to disappear in places where written history no longer reached. Their stories are incomplete, and it is precisely that incompleteness that makes them feel more real, more human. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us that history is a search without an ending. Every new brick uncovered, every new inscription revealed, every layer of earth pulled back has the power to change what we once believed was settled. Their disappearance is not a final full stop, but an invitation to keep searching, keep questioning, keep turning the past over in our hands. Because of them, archaeology exists. Because of them, history stays alive. Because of them, we understand that the past is not a finished painting, but a story still waiting to be continued. Perhaps that is why the lost legions remain with us. Not because they were more heroic or more important than the others, but because they represent something essential about history itself, the human desire to keep asking, and as long as the question remains, they remain, not on the battlefield, but in imagination, in books, in excavations, and in the stories we continue to pass forward. In the end, remembering them is remembering that the past never truly dies. It only lies quiet beneath the layers of earth, waiting to be called by name. And when we call it, the lost legions do not simply return. They return as an irreplaceable part of the human story.